There you
There you
go.
go.
This is the red light.
It's a technical group.
Yeah, I'm a little technical myself. First of all, my name is Francis Hamit. I'm the author of a book called The Queen of Washington, which came out about 6 months ago, just as I was in the VA hospital down in Westwood, basically fighting for my life. And before that, The Queen of Washington, which this group has already heard about. Now, we have a special offer on both of those books, which is on the blue form, and which I'm not going to go into too much. What I wanted to talk to you about tonight was The Queen of Washington and also the research process that gets used in creating historical fiction of this kind. Because as Civil War fans and members of the Civil War Roundtable, there's basically one phrase that describes all of it. You're very picky. You're very oriented towards the facts, even when it's fiction. Now, that made me work a lot harder than most novelists work to create a novel. Because most of us just make it up as we go along. But when you're dealing with characters based on real people, and you're dealing with real events, you really, really do have to get it right. And to do that, you have a problem anytime you talk about the Civil War, because everybody lied. I'm serious. Most of what you know about the Civil War is wrong. And why is this? Well, let's take the official records, those wonderful reports from Stonewall Jackson. Those weren't written by Stonewall Jackson. Those were written by Charles Faulkner several months after the battles in question, after Faulkner interviewed people who had been there who were still alive, and then cleaned up beyond that to make them look pretty for the public, because the public got to access all of this. So there was a lot of stuff that happened there that never got into the official records. There's some things that got into the official records that never happened. That's problem number one. Problem number two, these days when you start doing research on something, you go to the newspapers. Well, every newspaper back then was owned by some political party with a point of view. And that was their primary thing. The whole thing about objective journalism is basically an artifact of the 20th century, not the 19th. So people got slandered, got libeled in print, a lot of these things went on. Okay, diaries. Well, diaries are actually fairly reliable if the people in question, are just writing to themselves. If they're writing for what might be a later record, not so much. Letters are always filtered. Nobody really wants to tell you what a battle is actually like if they've been in one. It's either boring or terrifying. I was in Vietnam. It was mostly boring, but there were a few moments there in which, it was terrifying. But mortars are proof that you can get used to anything. Mortar attacks. Sort of like really heavy rain. So with all of your sources compromised, you really have to go back and forth to a whole bunch of different sources and compare them against one another. Now, when it comes to Rose Greenhow, everybody said, well, she left a book. Well, there was a problem with Rose's book, aside from the fact that she was probably one of the vilest racists you'd ever want to read, and kind of hateful. She didn't really write that book as much as she dictated it to a fellow named Henry Hotsey in London. Henry Hotsey was the chief propagandist for the Confederate government in Europe. He was also the special agent for the Confederate government buying weapons and so forth, and he was de facto the head of the European branch of the Confederate Secret Service. Henry Hotsey, by the way, was from Alabama, but he was born in Switzerland. He spoke 6 languages, and he subverted the entire English press simply by hiring starving journalists, paying them extremely well to write articles for which they were also being paid by their editors to give the Confederate point of view. He also ran a newspaper called The Index, which again was a very clever propaganda sheet, but his crowning achievement was when he had subverted Havas, which was basically the French equivalent of the Associated Press, and Havas fed official documents and official points of view to all of the newspapers in France, and he got his stuff to be distributed by Havas. Now, the French government had an interest in seeing the Confederates win, so did the British. And one of the points of the Queen of Washington is that nobody ever really looks at what happened before the war. The British and the French were fighting very hard to get back into the main part of the American continent. I mean, there was talk about seller's regret about the Louisiana Purchase. The French were absolutely livid. Napoleon III wanted back in the country so bad that he was willing to take Mexico. If we would give it to him, which we wouldn't, and he used the Civil War as an excuse to move Maximilian in there to try and set up a monarchy that the Mexicans didn't want and that the French couldn't run. And that lasted right up until the Civil War ended, and then all of a sudden we remembered about the Monroe Doctrine and said, go, get out, and Maximilian got himself shot. All of this feeds together. The French and the British were working hand in hand throughout the 1840s and 1850s to try and split this country in two. They were very pro-Confederate for one reason. They wanted to divide and conquer, because they saw the potential of America. They saw that in 50 years we would be a great power because we had endless natural resources, we had a temperate climate, we had millions of people coming in from Europe where they didn't feel particularly welcome and becoming citizens here and willing to fight for this country when they weren't willing to fight for their land of their native birth. It's sort of interesting. Most of the Union Army was German and Irish. I mean, born German and Irish. And they came from all over. They came from Minnesota, they came from Pennsylvania, and so forth. And on the Confederate side, they had a viewpoint there. They were equally mostly foreigners when they started out. The number of native-born soldiers, aside from the people on the abolitionist side who were very ideologically committed to the Union, Massachusetts and so forth, New York, Pennsylvania, and the people on the South, and those were mostly people in Louisiana and Virginia, and the rest of the country got sort of dragged along, and the governors of North Carolina and Georgia never did get with the program of the Confederate being a country rather than a collection of states. They kept trying to pull their troops out of the Confederate Army. So, when you're researching this stuff, where do you go to find this? Well, believe it or not, Google Books is the great place to go now to read original documents about the 19th century. It's all there. It was in all of these libraries. They scanned it in. Now you can not only find it, you can search it. You can do a name search, you can do a term search, and you come up with incredible resources. John Quincy Adams kept a diary all of his life. All 12 volumes are on Google Books. You can read day by day in the House of Representatives after he was president. You can find out who people like Cave Johnson was. Now, you never heard of this guy, but Cave Johnson turned out to be very important to the Queen of Washington because he was Rose Greenhouse's first boyfriend. He was also the Speaker of the House, and later the Postmaster General. And he married somebody else, but apparently he had a thing for Rose because he tried to keep the government from buying her husband's book, which was the history of California and Oregon. Robert Greenhouse married Rose sort of after, she had been around for a while. He had been in Europe. He came back. He was induced by Dolly Madison to, it was a political marriage from day one. Rose had like 8 children, but that just went with the territory. And most of Rose's children died. Now, Rose was married to Robert for about 20 years. Robert was a very bookish man. He had both a medical degree and a law degree. He'd studied at the Sorbonne. He'd come back, and he was the number 3 guy in the State Department. He was the translator and librarian, which sounds like some sort of clerk. But he was actually very high up in the structure, very powerful. And one of the things I noticed was that after Rose started getting accused by Jessie Benton Fremont, who was the daughter of Senator Benton, of spying for the French, Robert lost his job. they promoted him upward. They were very polite about it. And they sent him to Mexico because he spoke Spanish and he knew Code Napoleon, the legal system in France that the Mexicans are also using. It's used in a lot of countries in the world even now. And he basically was sent there to analyze these documents having to do with land claims. And the Mexican government, even though they had demanded that these things be honored under their laws, did absolutely nothing to help him and everything to frustrate him, so to the point where he finally resigned. By that time, he and Rose had gotten involved with a fellow named Jose Yves Limantour. I mention this because it's about the first third of the book. He produced some claims on California land, and they were rather extensive. One of them was the island of Alcatraz. Another one was about half the city of San Francisco as it stands today. At the time, it was a bunch of scrub land that wasn't even fit for raising cattle. But everything south of Market Street, basically. And he approached Robert about these claims. He's, basically making a trial run to see if this was going to pass muster with the American Commission and so forth. And Robert couldn't get himself on the commission. He could get a job as an associate law counsel, not even as law counsel, but as the number 2 guy. All of this interested me, and there came a point at which I sort of got away from being a historian and started writing a little bit of science fiction, which is what alternative history is. It's a form of science fiction. Because I deliberately changed a couple of facts in there. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but I think you'll feel happy for Robert that I made the decision what I did and had something happen to him other than what happened to him in his real life. The other fellow that showed up in San Francisco, aside from Lafayette Baker, who was basically out there being part of the Vigilance Committee, and is also very important in my narrative because he's also the founder of the United States Secret Service later on, is Judah P. Benjamin. Judah P. Benjamin was Robert's predecessor as Associate Land Counsel. Job paid $1,500 a year. Good job for a young, ambitious lawyer. Problem was that Judah P. Benjamin was the best-known international lawyer in the world. He regularly got fees of $25,000 for a single case. And you see, this is where the old spy in me comes to the fore. This doesn't make any sense. Why did he take that job? What was he doing there? What was he really doing there? He's out there working as Associate Land Counsel for the California Land Commission for $1,500 a year. He's in San Francisco. He's living a fairly lavish lifestyle that his salary certainly wouldn't support, but that doesn't matter because he makes a lot of money otherwise. And by the way, he's just about to become the junior senator from Louisiana because he's part of the Seidel machine. He's John Seidel's law partner. And by the way, he's also Abraham Lincoln's law partner. A little venture called the Illinois Central Railway. A lot of legal carpentry in creating a railroad, rights of way, land titles, leases, all of that kind of thing. So every lawyer in the country that had anything on the ball with commercial law was working on railroads because everybody was building them. Lincoln became extremely wealthy. He might have been born in a log cabin, but he could have lived in a mansion if he had so desired. But he had other ambitions, so he didn't so desire. He lived very modestly, but he was extremely wealthy, and he had law partners all over the place. Another one of his law partners was the guy who became his bodyguard during the Civil War.